Hello, welcome to InvertiCast. I, of course, am Leah from InvertiCast, but you also might know me from Tarantula. And today, I am going to be discussing the differences between wild caught and captive bred species of invertebrates. So, hopefully, I can help answer some questions for everybody and let's get the ball rolling. So, firstly, I'll discuss what it means for an invertebrate to be captive bred. Basically, that means that it is a specimen of invertebrate like a tarantula or, um, like assassin bugs or whatever that have already been in captivity and then they have been bred to continue the captive bred or the species in the hobby, essentially. And a wild caught specimen is one that somebody had gone into its natural habitats and collected it and then sold it into the hobby. So that is wild caught specimen. Um, so some of the topics that range on this particular topic is, is it good for wild caught to be introduced and brought into the hobby, or is it better to leave them in the wild? So if anyone has any questions, feel free to toss them in the comments. I will happily answer those questions, and you might even get your comment highlighted. Anyhow, so first and foremost, when you think of wild caught specimens, most people think of, you know, conservation, and that for me, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is wild caught specimens are not really um, they're just they're not very conducive to uh, conservation of that particular species in the wild. A really great example of this is in the tarantula world, the Poecilotheria metallica, which comes from India. It comes from actually a very small part of Sri Lanka, and because of the over capturing, like over collecting and over um, catching them from the wild and stuff, they're now on like less than 100 specimen in the wild, which is really bad for that ecosystem and that environment. Um, so that also means that that specific species of tarantula now has a far less chance of actually surviving in the wild and like continuing that bloodline. Now, on the other hand, some wild caught specimen can be good in the hobby because it is able to keep bloodlines kind of fresh and inbreeding shouldn't be as much of a problem, so long as there's sometimes wild caught specimen. We also have seen that when we get imports of wild caught specimens, uh, sometimes we also get species of tarantulas and inverts that we weren't actually expecting in those imports. Really great example of this is the Cereopicus. I believe it's the Cereopicus ariotibialis. This was a species that was previously mostly unknown to the hobby, and one they were sending in, Chilobrachys lividum or Cereopicus lividum, and other Chilobrachy species, and this Cereopicus ariotibialis appeared, and it was very confusing. But since then, it has become a very, very popular specimen species in the hobby. With that being said, there are plenty of captive bred specimen obviously available now. You can get plenty of captive bred specimens from all spectrums of the invertebrate world. However, wild caught specimens do help to kind of keep the bloodlines diversified and not so inbred, if you will. I am an advocate for captive bred specimens. I definitely am not super thrilled about having wild caught specimen in my collection. It's something that I definitely try to avoid at pretty much all cost. If I do believe that there is a wild caught specimen that is available and stuff, I typically won't purchase that specimen. I won't actually purchase that. So let me know what you guys think. Does anyone who is watching currently, do you have any wild caught specimens in your collections? And if you do, have you noticed if there's like a difference between them and your captive bred specimen? That's kind of leading into our next topic here, is that a wild caught specimen is not going to be quite as like docile and used to humans as a captive bred specimen will be. Um, the pet discarded. I appreciate that, Simon. He says, I would shoot anyone that brought in wild caught specimens that are already established in captivity. I completely agree with this, mainly because, in the name of conservation, as I've said before, like the more people are entrenching on those natural habitats of these specimens, the more people are going in there, the more they're going and capturing these species and tarantulas or, Madagascar hissing cockroaches, for example, then the more that habitat starts to disappear. So we're losing a lot of natural habitats in the whole world, just from deforestation and farming and agriculture and those kinds of things. As our populations grow, the forests and the wildlife tend to disappear, and unfortunately, that's really, really bad for a lot of reasons, like the climate. Another really great example of that would be the Great Barrier Reef, because it was over touristy and just overpopulated, and the water's temperatures were rising. It completely bleached out that uh, coral reef. And so, because of that loss of habitat, it had worldwide effects. Um, Oh, this is a great question from Carrie. She says, how does brown boxing and the selling wild caught specimen affect pricing of legitimate captive breds? This is actually a really, really great question because, again, there have been certain like dealers and breeders who have had like wild caught specimen come into the hobby. And because of that, sometimes they do sell them at a lower price. Um, and so that affects the overall hobby because then those captive bred specimens are too expensive for some people. And so they might look at those wild caught specimen as something that they would appreciate more because it's a little cheaper price. But if you're doing your research and you're really understanding what that species is and where it comes from and all those things, then it's much, much safer and much better to get those wild caught, you know, not to purchase the wild caught specimen, if you will. Wild caught are brought in by greedy vendors that want to make more money instead of making the efforts to breed them. I agree, Simon. Absolutely. The mantis garden, that is a very good point. I also agree with this. Some people think that it's much easier to just, like where I live here in Colorado, we do have a species of tarantula that is native to this region. It's known as the Aphana pelmahense, also known as the Texas brown or the Oklahoma brown. This is a really cool tarantula, but it is a very slow growing tarantula. So captive bred specimen of this species typically are sometimes kind of hard to find only because it is such a slow growing species. It takes at least 5 to 6 years for a specimen to mature if it is a female, and close to 3 to 4 years if it's a male. And even then, there's no guarantee of a captive bred egg sac. And so, what that means is possibly poachers can go out and collect a specimen or two and then sell those at a lower rate because they didn't put in a whole lot of time to breed that particular species. Also, with wild caught specimen, and this is the mantis garden, you make an excellent point. You're not going to know what you're getting from the wild. So, wild caught specimens tend to sometimes they have parasites or like nematodes or mites and stuff. And so, if you bring that into your collection, you could be infecting the rest of your collection with that same parasite. it is incredibly difficult to prevent nematodes, um, simply because it's just not it's not preventable. We can't really see nematodes. They're not. It's not like you can, detect them. By the time that you do detect them, it's too late. So usually it's a death sentence for a collection. I've heard of um, like people losing almost half of their entire collection due to parasites from like wild caught specimens. So again, that's kind of a downfall of the wild caught specimens. Um, Definitely not wonderful, obviously. Also, wild caught specimen, like I said, they're going to be a little more wild, so they'll probably be a little more spicy. They're going to have much more of an attitude. When I first got into the hobby, my personal experience with wild caught specimen was with a Euphobatus marinus, also known as the skeleton leg tarantula. And the specimen that I got was just absolutely spicy and hated people, and just, I don't want to personify the tarantula too much, but this particular specimen, she was just very, very feisty and incredibly unhappy and stressed. And so, because she was that wild caught specimen, I ended up actually losing her a little earlier than I had anticipated. Although I didn't know how old she was. I didn't know like what she had been eating before. You know what I mean? There's no guarantee on the health of that tarantula. Um, just because they're wild caught and you don't know. You don't know how long they've lived there. You don't know how old they are. Um, and so yeah, it could be very, very difficult to be able to map that out. Like tarantulas don't show their age like we do. And any invert for that matter, they don't really show their age like we do. I mean, when they're young, we know that they're young because they're small. But as far as like adult tarantulas, no, and adult inverts in general, like we can't have you can't really have an estimate of how old they really are. Um, like I said before, wild caught specimens, though, can be detrimental for a lot of reasons, like those parasites. We don't know exactly how old they are, where they come from, um, and it also is really detrimental to their natural habitat. Um, and there have been many, many controversies over the years, especially in like the tarantula hobby. I know that in the UK, there was a lot of controversy that surrounded what species was that? Nat was telling me all about it. But here in the US, there was a major controversy actually within the last 5 years about the Typhoclena celadonia, or the T. celadonia, or Brazilian jewel, as a lot of us know it. Um, And what had happened was Brazil claimed that the person who imported the T. celadonia didn't follow through with the proper channels, they didn't have the proper permits, and all of those things. Fortunately, that has all been cleared up, and it's not quite as big of a controversy now as it was, because that person who did import them was able to clarify everything, and you know they were able to, go through the proper channels and show that paperwork, and prove that they were not in the wrong, which is really great for them. But in other cases, where if that kind of accusation comes upon another breeder, it's something that can be a complete and total death sentence to that person's career. So that's another thing to consider when it comes to wild caught specimen. Also, because of the T. celadonia controversy, Brazil has become a lot more like Australia, and they have tightened up their restrictions as far as what animals can be exported and what animals cannot be exported. So that is another thing that plays a pretty large factor into the hobby and kind of where it is. So captive bred specimens typically, I feel, they're worth the price. If they are a little more expensive than those wild caught guys, then they're worth that price, because you're not only you're not only going to be paying for a wonderful specimen that is going to be healthy, it's not going to have those parasites. I mean, the chances of it are a lot lower, um, but you're also going to get a specimen that you can grow with. I know a lot of people who kind of come into the hobby and they're super new to it. And the last thing they want is a sling. And I totally understand that because slings are so tiny. But with getting like juveniles and subadults, again, from reputable breeders, that's actually going to work in their benefit because, again, they can grow with that tarantula and they can learn with that tarantula and keep keep going as far as that goes. Whereas wild caught specimen, it's not really going to be like that. Most likely, it's going to be an adult that is already at its full size and spicy behaviors, and it's not going to be acclimated to being in captivity like captive bred specimens are. So, well, I recommend staying away from wild caught specimen. Leave that to the breeders because they are the ones who are helping the hobby grow and continue uh, continue flourishing and keeping those species alive. I do also, like I mentioned before, with the Poecilotheria metallica, uh, that specimen, that species, is thriving wonderfully in the hobby. I mean, pretty much any exotic pet show or any exotic animal dealer here in the States, like a reptile, store or something like that, you will probably find a Poecilotheria metallica. They're pretty common in the hobby. They're still a little expensive. I have seen some of them being sold for $250 for a spiderling. And obviously, like the older they get, like the the price goes up a little bit just because they are much larger and there's been more time dedicated to that specific specimen. But yes, captive bred is much, much better for the hobby, all around, for sure. Also, it's much, much better for conservation. I know this is something that a lot of people preach, conservation. What does that actually mean? Well, conservation means that, like I said before, the more people that are venturing into the native habitats, um, then the more those natural habitats are going to disappear. A really great example of that is Sri Lanka and India. The the specimen that have been captured and brought into the hobby, they over capture them and over capitalize on that, and then they bring them into the hobby and um, those specimen, they do well, but their natural habitat doesn't anymore. Tarantulas have a very important and key role in nature. They are part of the ecosystem, and the part that they play is actually they are like population control for other invertebrates. So if you have too many of one invert that say eats foliage, eats leaves and whatnot, tarantulas actually help to keep them uh, their populations lower. So you're not going to have as much of that foliage disappearing and stuff from that invert that eats the foliage. Here we have caterpillars and hornworms, things like that will like just devour plants. And without spiders that catch them and kill them and eat them, then we would have no foliage. And that is, again, bad news for that natural habitat. Let's see, the mantis guardian. Um, yes, Carrie asked, let's see, are wild caught more likely to have parasites? And how does that risk affect your collection? Yes, wild caught definitely have a higher chance of having those parasites. And the parasites, unfortunately, can be very, very difficult to control and to manage. And so, yeah, like entire collections can be wiped out pretty quickly just due to that fact. Um, yeah, so, and then the mantis garden says, let's see, I've seen tubs of mantis nymphs come in from African with different species in them. And that's another invert that definitely can suffer from that wild caught uh, habit, that poachers might have and stuff is mantises, um, which and it's honestly unnecessary. Like here in the States, we have fear not tarantulas, we have you know micro wilderness and um, a few others, like even rubber ducky isopods, who we've had on the channel before. Um, their their specimen are all captive bred, or at least most of them are. There are some instances that are like the wild caught does come in. Like I know micro wilderness every now and then will have some wild caught specimen, but again, they're only doing it to make sure that they diversify that bloodline of those specific species. Because keeping that bloodline diversified actually helps also reduce the chances of bad molts and uh, parasites, all of those things. So it's really, really better, better for the hobby, better for the world and our environment for captive bred to be the way to go. Another great example of how this can affect the ecosystems where you live. I live here in Denver, Colorado, and recently we had a major problem of deer being overpopulated, and unfortunately they're not the brightest animals in the world, and they want to cross highways and stuff, and so they get run over by trucks or they get hit by cars and things like that, and so it can be pretty disastrous for those creatures. um, but recently, because of the deer overpopulation, which also leads to disease within those colonies or those packs of deer, and overeating, like so the deer will overeat and overrun the foliage and the plants that are all throughout their natural habitat. And the reason why they were overpopulating and doing all of those things was because there weren't a whole lot of natural predators to reduce the amount of deer uh, that are taking over the habitats, right? We do have mountain lions and black bears, but they can only do so much. So Colorado reintroduced wolves. Um, they reintroduced wolves into the natural habitat of the wolves, and those wolves have now helped the deer populations kind of simmer down. And now our foliage is also coming back. We're having more trees. We're having better better ecosystem. The air is a lot more clear because of those plants, because they are given that chance to thrive. Everything kind of works in a balance in ecosystems. And so, because of that, over poaching and over collecting some of these wild specimen can be very detrimental to those natural habitats. And deer and wolves are a really great example of that. But when we're talking about invertebrates, obviously it's going to be much smaller scale than that, but it still has as big of an impact as those deer and wolves do. So, yeah, so let's see. Let's go to some comments here. Okay. So it looks like you guys are talking with one another. That's wonderful to see. I love that. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to pop them on in there. Um, but there typically is a lot of like controversy around brown boxing and wild caught specimen entering into the hobby. Most people in the hobby, I do believe, kind of look down on that and are not super fond of those of those kind of practices. Like I said, they're very, very bad for the environment. Like, let's say, uh, another really good example of this is when wild caught specimen do come into an environment that is not native to them or is not normal to them. A really great example of that is Florida. So, the, the state of Florida here in the United States, they actually are having at this moment a pretty big issue with Burmese pythons that are overrunning the Everglades. And so, because of that, these very large, very incredible, beautiful snakes, of course, are overrunning the natural habitats of Florida. And so that means there's more competition for the alligators that also live there. There's more competition for other predators that are going to prey on the same prey that the Burmese pythons do. Um, and so we're going to see, the effects of that. So alligators are not going to have as great of a chance of survival um, because that Burmese python is just running amok. And we're also seeing a loss of green anoles in Florida, or brown anoles, because green anoles somehow were released and they are an invasive species. And again, there's too much competition for the food that they need and their sustenance. Um, and so, because of that, we're seeing a loss of that natural specimen in the Florida Everglades. So those brown anoles, they're a little bit smaller than green anoles. They're not equipped to have that kind of competition. So unfortunately, they are now like an endangered species, and we could very well see an extinction event with the brown anoles because of green anoles. And I'm not saying that every green anole that's in Florida was a wild caught specimen. This also leads to another thing of irresponsible pet owners who, for whatever reason, they feel that they can't take care of this animal anymore, and or they don't want it, or maybe they were scared off for some reason, and so they release them into the wild, which is really, really bad. That's actually a pretty big mistake. So if that ever does occur, and say, you have some hissing cockroaches and they have reproduced so much that you cannot like take care of so many of them, the best thing to do is to find a rescue nearby, or like even a pet store, like the exotic reptile pet stores. They will help. They will take on that specimen and help help you be rid of it, but also not allow it to overrun the native territories in your area, which is much better. All right, let's see, guys. I love it. Thank you guys so much for commenting. I really appreciate it. Shady Things, hello, and the Mantis Garden. You guys are all wonderful. So Carrie also says that I read in a chat that someone only bought from large corporation pet stores because she thought it ensured that it wasn't wild caught. Is that an accurate thought? Unfortunately, it is not an accurate thought. A lot of the big chain pet stores sometimes will have uh, a wild caught specimen. I know here in the States we have like Petco and PetSmart, and I don't recommend going to them for your invertebrate needs or your reptile needs, only because they typically will have imports that are wild caught specimen. And so for the overall thrivability, or like the life of that specimen, is not going to be as great as it was if they were in the wild. Um, that's just part of their natural way. So so stop making it. I'm not failing. I'm doing all right, you guys. Anyhow, yeah, so those big chain pet stores, they don't always go through captive bred channels. And most of the time when they do have invertebrates in, they are wild caught specimen. I know right now Mexico is also working on becoming a lot more effective as far as like tightening their belt with imports and exports, because the Brachypelma species that are native to Mexico are starting to become more and more endangered. And so, which also means that prices of even captive bred specimen here in the States are going to go up just because of that rarity and that endangered uh, status of that specimen. So it's not great for the hobby. It's definitely not good for the environment, or their natural habitats, and it's not good for those specific specimen for sure. You guys are so funny. I'm sorry, I'm not caught up on the comments. But so basically, to sum up, wild caught specimen are only reasonable or justifiable, honestly, when it comes for the breeders and the main dealers and stuff who have, their specimen of that particular species, and that wild caught specimen that they bring in actually helps to diversify the bloodlines. As I said before, it makes sure that those bloodlines are pure and they're kind of clean, and it helps to prevent, you know, uh, deformities and like egg sacs not being quite as good as they could be. Um, so try to avoid wild caught specimens as much as you can, you guys, and always go with captive bred. I'm definitely advocate for captive bred specimen, mainly because of that reason. Conservation is such a huge thing in this world today. If you think about it too, if you could just go out in your backyard and collect whatever mantises or, you know, dragonflies that you wanted, that means that there's going to be less mantises and less dragonflies in the wild in your backyard that are going to take care of other pests that you're not really super fond of. Um, so yeah, I was going to volunteer to help. Oh, thank you, Mantis Garden. I appreciate that. Trying to doing the best that I can at the moment, but yeah. So losing a few points. I don't know. Unfortunately, Nat had another obligation that he was involved in. Oh, hello.
Hello. I did. I've only just got in, Leah. So, but I've listened to a little bit so far. It sounds like
Oh
you're
yeah,
having a really nice conversation at the moment.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, definitely. I think I've hit a couple of pretty decent points there, and talking about kind of the natural habitats and why
mhm.
it's not so great for them to be wild caught. But I'm sure you've got a few really great insights in that.
Well, have you covered the topic of just deforestation? So,
I
like
did a
how much?
smidge,
Yeah.
but yeah,
So,
go right ahead.
so sort of thinking about when we think about the Poecilotheria, for instance, Poecilotheria metallica
Hmm.
is a prime one that their numbers are dwindling in
Yes.
in the wild, and partly because they are pretty and blue and everyone wants one. So people are going out and poaching them, um, which it's not a collection with a permit; it is poaching. So it's something that we really do need to take on board, isn't it? Because
Yes.
if the wild species of the air of the animals of the area are taken out, um, there's no reason to um, reason to preserve the natural habitat, which then gets taken over for extensive farming and things. Though there have
Hmm.
been suggestions recently that they are adapting slightly to living in more built up areas, but that's not really ideal.
Mm.
And something that I was reading the other day, which shocked me even more, was that it's not just taking the specimens out of the wild, but some people are leaving the specimens there, but taking the egg sacs.
Mm.
So, and those are the egg sacs that are there to sort of populate and um, keep everything going. I could see that Simon is saying it happened a few years ago with the orchid mantis. It became so popular that people were taking ooze from the wild, and the population
Hmm.
plummeted. And that's one of the things is everyone wants that new exciting thing, don't they?
Yes,
They
absolutely. Of
they
course.
want they want that new exciting tarantula. I believe there was just a brand new one that's been discovered in the Amazon. I haven't done any research on it yet, but everyone's going to want that. Now,
Yes.
we don't know what that population size is, and
Mhm.
it's not just taking it from the wild it is actually for our selfish benefit, isn't it? So
A little.
I think we would be Maris to say that um, that we haven't. No one has dealings with wild caught tarantulas or mantis or any other invertebrates because they had to come from somewhere at the very beginning.
Ooh,
But
and
yeah,
Shady Things also is saying that it's happening now with the Vietnam silver tarantula, that they're taking mom and sacks
Yeah.
from the wild, and that I agree that can be devastating in that environment.
But also the impact that it's having on the ecosystem themselves, like
Hmm.
they're within that ecosystem, within the food chain, and they play a part on that. Whether we're taking monkeys or
Hmm.
mantis, it's going to impact,
Yeah,
and you might end up with an outbreak of another more undesirable um, invertebrate that's maybe eating crops and things when you're taking these things out of the wild. So
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, captive bred, there's a lot of benefits to only purchasing from captive bred. Not only are you going to be supporting, a local business to where you are, or like a national business, sometimes they're national, like Fear Not Tarantulas.
mhm,
Um, but you're going to be supporting that business, but you're also going to be helping that conservation of that specific species, because the
yeah,
more captive bred specimen that you buy, the less that need to be poached from the wild, i- if that makes sense.
yeah, and I have to agree with that. It does. However, I always feel there is a slight however on that. People do want the big adult spider.
Yes, they do.
So it's like that confidence, isn't it? So about people having confidence to raise a sling
Hmm.
and do that. And lots of people, well, I think we're within a culture where we're like, now we want it now, and we want this big beautiful thing. And
Yes,
actually, for me, the hobbies taught me a lot of patience. Actually,
me
is
too.
I have lots of tarantulas in my collection at the moment. That are like the Brazilian blue, or like
Hmm.
electric this, and you know,
Yeah.
bright
Oh,
colors
the
that, and they're all brown at the
Birubium
moment.
cimaroxagorum.
Yeah,
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 you
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah. So the rubies, um, but but they're all brown at the moment, and people are like, oh, it is that, and I don't know how we get over that hurdle. Um,
It's difficult because I do think that a lot of beginners come into the hobby and they kind of think, well, a little tiny thing, they might get one or two little tiny slings or something like that, and they find it to be very difficult. Um, but it's kind of ironic, because if you are doing that research, if you are kind of following what the hobby does and just kind of where we go with everything, then it doesn't have to be so difficult. So just kind of keeping up with that education really, really helps, along with the hobby, and ensuring that species longevity. Because if it disappears in the wild, then it's going to disappear from the hobby. it's,
I was
it's just a
actually,
matter of.
yeah, it is a matter of fact, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about breeding, um, I, I could be wrong, Leah, but please do correct me if I'm wrong. But
Sure.
or the chat as well is I've read that through generational breeding that that they become less fertile as well. So
Ooh,
through generations and generations, but I'm not
no,
too
that
sure about that.
actually kind of makes sense, because we even see that in, canines. You get all these like domesticated, and well, they call them designer dogs and whatnot.
Yeah.
Is because, if you have a poodle that is pure blood poodle and all these things, eventually those poodles can't reproduce quite as well as they had, when they first kind of showed up.
Mhm.
So diversifying those bloodlines is definitely necessary. But as I said before, I think that it's better left to those breeders, to the people who are providing those captive bred
Oh,
specimen in the hobby.
most definitely, and I heard what you were saying before I came on. There is definitely a place for wild caught with a
Hmm.
license, not poaching. It's a license
Right.
to do it to get that done. I don't know about you, Leah, but I have had people messaging me, so they'd be messaging Somerset Spiders.
Uh-huh.
Hi, would you like some black tarantulas? Okay, having conversations, and it is like, yes, I have loads in my village in India, and it's like, yeah, we can't really do that, can we?
Yeah, we're not
So,
doing.
so
I
it's sort of like,
haven't.
with a license and things like that. But also,
Yeah.
I find it very interesting that, say, other invertebrates such as scorpions and centipedes are generally wild caught
I've heard that
um,
too. I have
within
heard that.
captivity.
Although I know that there are quite a few species of like scorpions that do really well being captive bred, and I think the giant Asian forest scorpion is one of them that does really well in captivity, and it also does really well being captive bred. I know I've seen lots of captive bred specimen here in the States. I'm not really sure about the UK, but yeah, I mean, some species of scorpion, I like to think them as kind of like orb weavers.
Yeah,
Orb weaver spiders don't always do very good in captivity, so they're kind of just better left alone. Um, but they are gorgeous and they're beautiful. It's just we can't really provide them the space and uh, basically the environment that they would actually really need to thrive. So orb weavers tend to not do very well at all in captivity.
no,
So
yeah. Kerry's
yeah,
got a very, very good question. Sort of thinking, do you think
yeah,
that that it can have an opposite effect, like where we see invasive species like the Chinese mantis? I think there is lots of issues around that, isn't there? About when we're talking about brown boxing. I'm not
hmm
sure. Is this about brown boxing today, Leah, or is it more wild caught?
it's
It's
brown
more
box. I haven't
a bit
touched
both.
brown boxing totally,
Okay.
but yeah, yeah, we got all of it.
I think like smuggling. Hey,
Yes.
so smuggling, you're gonna there's possibilities of having invasive species
Hmm.
coming into the country. There might be a reason. So if we look at the border controls in Australia and New Zealand, like
Hmm.
that's so strict.
They are
Um,
incredibly strict. Yes,
but there is reasons behind that because it does impact the ecosystem.
it
And
does.
um, Simon might have something to say on this, but it's a bit like the 'cause I know he's written a book about hedgehogs, so he might know about squirrels. But it's a bit like in England with the grey and red squirrels.
Uh
So
huh.
the grey squirrels are in an invasive species that have effectively kicked the red squirrels off the land as such. So
Oh no.
and that can be transferred over into invertebrates, can't it? So you're gonna
Absolutely.
there's always a battle for resources, for food,
Hmm.
all of those sorts of aspects. And
Yeah.
when we think about like invasive species, like I don't know whether brown boxing could incre- it could increase the likelihood of an invasive species, but that's when you come down to having an irresponsible keeper who might release
Hmm.
them into the wild. Um,
Like the green anoles in Florida, actually,
yeah,
and Burmese pythons. Um, a couple of irresponsible owners, and maybe they just didn't want that specimen for whatever reason, and then they release it into the wild, and now it has it has just rendered havoc all throughout that
mhm.
environment. Especially with the green anoles have
and
actually knocked out brown anoles.
yeah, and the iguanas as
Yep,
well,
yep, iguanas. Yep,
and parrots and things. But
right.
I think a very valid point though is that lots of people don't know
Hmm.
that they are breaking the law when they get something brown boxed to them because they
Hmm.
may not even know it's being brown boxed. So, for instance, I know that in the States, you can only send live animals through UPS or
Hmm.
UPS or FedEx, one of them.
FedEx. Yeah.
And there is a law against sending venomous creatures through your mail system. Um, so it can't be sent through the post. But you might
Right.
get sellers who will go, "Hey, it's a bit cheaper. I'll send it through the post and
Right.
things." And it's sort of, but it's when you get people maybe buying stuff from the states, so they might go onto arachnoboards
Hmm.
for instance, and there might be. Let's pick on a country. Let's pick on, I don't know, Spain. There's someone in Spain saying, "I ship tarantulas worldwide." And what they'll do is they will just send them through the normal post system. So there's a couple
Yeah.
of risks there, isn't there? So you've
Yeah.
got the risk of the animal dying,
Yeah.
the risk
Because
of having
Spain
your
to
yeah,
Massachusetts is going to be at least a month or two.
Yeah,
ride.
exactly. Even if it's air mailed over and
Mhm.
everything, there is the possibility of you getting a really big fine
Mm.
for receiving a parcel with animals in that hasn't been declared because it has to go through all the right things. There's also the possibility, and it sort of goes back onto the wild caught topic
Mhm.
as well. There is the possibility of introducing a disease into your collection. So, and
Yes,
that could be something like nematodes, let's say. So,
right, or
or
a
any of
specific kind of
parasitic mites.
right, right,
Um,
right. And who knows? Because that sometimes you don't know. Like those mites could also affect, say it's affecting your tarantula that you got brown boxed, but it also could affect your reptiles. It could possibly affect your, cats and dogs. So you just don't know what kind of parasites are in there and what could possibly cause damage. I do know that here occasionally we have bananas shipped in from like Costa Rica and places where the bananas are native. And so along with bananas, we also get little hitchhikers like banana spiders or the
yeah,
Brazilian wandering spider. I've heard of these guys coming into the states only because they were hiding among the bananas, and then boom, there they are.
yeah. We actually had a local supermarket closed down in the UK just the other day. I think the headline was quite funny. It was
Yes,
store closed down, fear of spider that can cause permanent erection, which is one of
I
them. One of
saw
them
that.
again. Yeah.
I,
Um,
I did see that. Yeah. And
to
I
be
I was
fair,
laughing, but
I would really like some of my own bananas from that shop just for the spider.
just for the
No other
spider,
reason. No, no other reason.
right?
But we actually do see it on some of the chat groups as people will get they'll buy some bananas and
Hmm.
they'll have they'll have
That have one of
an
those.
egg sac on it. No spiders, but no egg sac. But also,
Uh,
Simon's put a really interesting comment in there. Um,
oh,
is about breeding to a point, so they're booming in captivity
okay.
to a point where they can be released back into the wild.
See, and
Now,
that is something that I actually really agree with.
yeah,
Um, because I almost I wonder if this is something that we could do with the Poecilotheria metallica, because its numbers are so low. But we have an abundance of them here in the hobby, and so I always wonder that, like, could we take half of a sack and just put it in the wild? But I'm not
well,
sure.
Bugs in cyberspace, he does that, doesn't he?
I believe so.
So he's one of the sort of he's really into sustainability and things, and he does sell wild caught tarantulas. But he has big breeding projects where he releases half the sack
Hmm.
always back into the wild, which I think is brilliant. But I think he's probably not the only one, but in my mind, he's the only one that actually does that who's very vocal about it.
Hmm.
And I think it's a brilliant idea, but I think there is a barrier to it, Leah. And I think the
Mm,
biggest barrier to it is money.
I
So
agree.
so when people go, "Oh, well, I've got a sling," and I don't know how much would a Poecilotheria metallica be for you guys over
Um,
there?
right now, it depends on where you go, but usually you can get them for about 150 to 250 for a sling.
Yeah, so that's actually quite a lot
It
of
is.
money.
Yes.
So when people are doing that, and I have been, I've been listening to Tom Moran quite a lot,
Hmm.
as always in the car, and it just ponders through my head sometimes. It's like, is there not anything we can do where there's like a breeding project where these numbers are dwindling,
Hmm.
where we can put them back in? But then you're going to have to be thinking about having like a protected area, so like a
Right.
nature reserve, things like that,
Well, and that's
because
kind of
in a couple of years people are just going to take them out again, which would be an issue.
possibly. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think eh, for that to be effective, I think that it would have to be localized. Like, so for me here in Colorado, say I had an Aphonopelma hensi, which
yeah,
is a native species here. The best way to kind of help that would just to do it locally. So if you know, like you in the UK, you guys get those. They're called ladybird spiders,
Yeah.
or they're a type of velvet spider. And they were thought to be extinct until they were found. But because because the hobby is what it is, they are they are pretty abundant, if you will, in the
Yeah.
hobby. And so, say if you had a couple of the ladybird velvet spiders, it's possible if you had a sack, you could release part of that sack
Hmm.
and help um, those numbers, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I do it with black widows, and if I find a black widow or like a jumping spider, I will, if they are already bred or if they're already like gravid, then for the most part, I only keep a couple for my own breeding project, but I release the rest. And I don't really go too far because they're pretty much all over the place. So I have a couple of jumping spider sacks that I released really close to my home because I find them all the time, all over the place.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
but
I think, yeah, and I doubt that in your state you're lacking of spiders. I think
mhm,
I think it seems to happen more so as well in more impoverished areas.
mhm.
That's when we start thinking about Brazil, Mexico,
Sri Lanka,
Sri Lanka,
yeah.
uh, certain parts of India and Europe. So
Mm,
you can see why people do it. Um,
mhm,
there's a big craze. They're going to make a quick couple of bucks. I think one of the
right.
really big issues with it as well, though, is they're going around collecting all of these spiders, and by the time they're shipped over, let's say you spend um, it doesn't even have to be spiders, mantis as well, anything.
Mhm.
You put them in. Let's say you send 100 items over, you're gonna get about a 30% death rate
Oh,
anyway
yeah,
through
just from the trip alone.
from the trip, through stress, dehydration, all this. Because
Right,
lots of these people as well don't know how to properly pack them.
right.
So that's another thing.
I agree. No,
Yeah,
definitely. But
yeah.
it's tough out there. I mean, I think the more captive bred we can do, the better.
Mm,
Um, but I do agree. I think there's a really great quote that says, "Desperation is the mother of all crime." So, and when we're talking about brown boxing and poaching, it is a crime,
yeah,
And so, in these, impoverished places, then there is a lot of desperation. So it's it just kind of leads to that, unfortunately. So I agree
yeah.
with you.
You, and as Simon has said as well, uh, they get a week's worth of wages for an ooth.
Mm,
It's a no, as he says, it's a no-brainer. But I think we just need to be sort of responsible in the hobby and trying to express that we need to, we need to preserve this hobby. And
mhm.
one, have you touched on why another reason why wild caught and brown boxing might be bad if we start thinking about the wildlife federation agencies and stuff and what they might do?
No, I haven't.
So if we were to think about it,
Yeah.
everyone's going out making, picking up mantis and uh, millipedes, centipedes, all of this kind of
Mhm,
thing, and taking them from a country. But it, it is a crime, as you said, and it filters into a
mhm,
crime. And like
mhm.
we see it quite a lot with Brazil closing their
Right.
borders down to any imports or exports
Right.
of animals. It happened a bit in Mexico for a while, I believe, a
Yeah.
couple of years
Mexico's
back.
they are
Um,
definitely going in
uh,
that direction.
there are there's lots of those restrictions that are getting put down, and then what happens?
Mhm.
Luckily, in Europe, it's not as bad over here. I know within the states, it is a state by state as well. So some states you're not even allowed to transfer a Pokeletharia over state
Right.
lines.
Right.
Um,
I
and
believe the Poecilotheria miranda is one,
yeah,
and the Vittata. I believe
yeah,
those two are very hard to get your hands on them
Yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
they're
And
not within your own state. So,
exactly. And what can happen is you'll end up just having what you can have in your own state, because
hmm
also you're going to need a big spider community within your state
hmm
to make it worth even breeding a spider. And then so people are going to stop doing that, and then it's, it is going to dwindle. And but it's really hard to sort of measure with the invert hobby, not just tarantulas, but just the invert hobby in itself growing.
absolutely.
It is growing and growing and growing. It's absolutely bonkers how fast it's growing.
Well, the
Uh,
demand is exceeding the supply,
yeah,
and
and
so
that's
that's
once again wild caught goes back to wild caught again, doesn't it? And
yes,
it's tricky.
absolutely, yeah. So this is a pretty big topic. There's a lot to it. Um, and so yeah, I mean, I'm excited to hear from other people and what they think about it, and kind of uh, see if there's ideas of things that we can do within the hobby that help that conservation and help those specimen in the wild. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's very dangerous, I think, for wild caught specimen. Mostly, the parasites, the habitat loss, it, you don't know exactly how old that specimen is, or how it has fared in the wild. You don't know the
I
history behind it.
I hear
It's
that quite a lot with scorpions. Actually, people will have them, and
mm,
and, and they'll pass within 6 months
yeah,
or so, and they'll pop it onto a group, and people will be like, "That you got sold a really old scorpion fully grown. You don't know how old it is," and
right,
it just
right.
it feeds into it.
Yeah, it's wild. So, and I believe Simon was saying that the velvet spiders are super protected over there. So, um, he says that if you actually even touch one, they're extremely protected. So, yeah, and that makes sense. I do think that all creatures, have a impact on their environment. They have, a role that they play
Hmm.
in their natural habitat, and so by taking those specimen out of the wild, you are going to be impacting their role. You're going to be basically limiting their reach, um, and that can be, really bad for that ecosystem.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, most definitely. And there are things that we can do as responsible invert keepers as
mhm.
well. So one of the suggestions would be, if you're looking to buy a spider, mantis, uh, a vampire crab, even
Right,
ask the seller where they're from. So a
right,
responsible seller should be able to tell you where they're from, whether they are captive bred or wild caught.
hmm
Um, and they shouldn't have an issue with telling you where they're from either.
right,
Sometimes it's a bit tricky because you might have someone that's bought into an import and doing that, but generally they would still know. It's the people that are just trying to sell you stuff um,
yeah,
over Facebook Messenger when you
yeah,
get like
right,
these messages. I'm actually
yeah,
getting them at the moment, where people going, "Oh, my friend bought this off of you, but I think it's a scam because I don't sell anything." But yeah, it's about just asking those questions. No one really minds if they're reputable sellers. They won't mind at all.
right. And then, I agree with you on that for sure. If there's somebody who's out there who has, they're a reputable seller, they're doing their captive bred, they'll be very upfront with that, and they'll be, proud of that, because I do agree that that's something that is definitely something to be proud of. But if they are shady about it, if they're not really forthcoming, or if they're just not, then be wary of that. Be wary of that dealer. Absolutely. It looks like shady things, and uh Simon, or they're talking about buying mantises from one another, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What a wonderful chat
So, but if people do want to buy Mantis in the UK, hit Simon up from the Mantis Garden.
from the
He
Mantis Garden. Yeah.
he doesn't just sell mantis; he has many other things, and he'll even sell you a tarantula. He'll probably sell you Liliana's tarantulas to get them out of the house, but just don't tell her.
Right.
But Simon, I've had some mantis from Simon, and they're absolutely fantastic. So
I love it.
he's a really reputable person to buy them from because he's done live streams of him actually breeding his mantis and things, so we know where they come from, which is good.
Yes. I'm pretty jealous of you guys over in the UK, to be honest, because you have a whole invert show, whereas here in the States, it's kind of gets lumped in with the reptile expos and shows, and so I'm not sure that invertebrates here are as popular or as like established, if you will, as they
Mhm.
are in the UK. So you know, I think I know of like one place where you can get really great captive bred mantises, and that would be usmantis.com.
Okay.
And they do captive bred. They have their own. I know Micro Wilderness does some mantises too, but yeah, it's tough. It's tricky. It's tricky to find good ones.
Yeah,
So,
but you have got some brilliant sellers and breeders in the States
oh yeah,
for for
yeah,
your inverts, haven't you? So
absolutely, yeah,
yeah,
yep, love it. Thank you so much for popping on.
no worries.
I think I was drowning.
I
Just kidding.
I think you did really well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And I'll just do a little plug for anyone that listens afterwards. But if people wanted to get a tarantula that's not wild caught, they can go
Mhm,
to the Spider Shop UK, and that's thespidershop.com, and
mhm.
use code Somerset to get a cheeky little discount. So,
Awesome. I
which
wonder
is
if that
always
does
nice.
that extend does that extend here in the US? Because I know the Spider Shop is here as well.
No, so you've got the Spider Shop. It's got like an extra P or an extra O in it. This
Right.
is
It's like
this is the Spider Shop UK.
ah, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, two different companies. Two different companies.
Yeah,
Yeah, they've got like an extra P in the Spider Shop, I think, in your
they
Spider
do.
Shop.
Like PPE, something
Yeah,
like that. Yeah.
because the Spider Shop UK was set up before the US one. So
Mm,
yeah.
interesting. I know
Yeah.
I think that we also still have that 25% off of rubber ducky if you just
Oh yeah.
type in InvertiCast 25 at rubber ducky isopods.
Yeah.
So we still, I think there's a little bit more time on that one. So don't forget that.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. Well, thank you, Leah. Gonna
Absolutely. Thank you, Nat.
no
And thank you,
worries.
everyone, for watching. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye.